My name is Anna Smolensky. I'm a hospice care consultant and area leader of diversity, equity, and inclusion for Accent Care Hospice. Um, and our main focus today will be navigating through grief and loss, and also kind of starting off with, what hospice support looks like as it relates to ensuring that we're supporting through grief and loss as well. I also have here Brienne Carbaugh, and I'll let her introduce herself, of course, our bereavement specialist.
Hi, thank you, Anna. I'm Brienne Carbaugh. I'm the bereavement specialist for the Accent Care Hospice Maryland site. We cover pretty much all of Central Maryland, up to I want to say up to like DC, up to Frederick County, all the way to the Bay Bridge and North Maryland, and so we cover a large portion, and we also offer bereavement support for all of our patients, all of their loved ones and their family members, as well as any community members. So regardless as to if their loved one died on our services or not, we can follow for bereavement. They can just give us a call. We're always here. So I'm glad that Anna asked me to kind of jump in and just help to give sort of the insight on some of the grief elements that we'll talk about today.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this slide, we just want to kind of touch on a couple points. So Accent Care Hospice and Palliative Care. So as it relates to some of the topics we'll talk about in navigating through grief and loss, a lot of times we want to preface that having support in terms of reliable medical professionals and a team that is really circling around not just patients that are going through certain circumstances of a terminal condition, but their family that's dealing with different stages of grief. So one of the things we wanted to touch on is ensuring that everybody's aware of what benefits are out there. So Accent Care Hospice and Palliative Care, we of course utilize the hospice benefit. We're a hospice provider following Medicare guidelines. And as Brienne mentioned, we do cover a large portion of Maryland from DC, Montgomery County, all the way through to Cecil County. We are a national organization. And hospice really is a benefit that's considered for folks that are in a chronic disease management terminal condition of a 6-month or less prognosis determined by 2 physicians. And ultimately, it's there to support aging in place and making sure that we're able to create, a quality of life comfort care and ensure that the patient and family and also those extended members of that family are continuing to get support in all the different stages of a terminal illness and different stages that we'll talk about in grief and loss. So the services include a interdisciplinary team of a physician, a hospice physician. You can also elect your own attending physician. There's always a nurse that conducts a plan of care to help manage medications, manage that customized plan as things continue to change, so that we can make sure that you're not bouncing back and forth to the hospital or to doctor's offices as things are declining. Also an aide that is part of that personal care items, but of course, custodial care is still up to the private caregivers and family members. Or of course, a nursing facility, if that's the direction things go in terms of placement. Music therapy for holistic approach to managing those symptoms. Chaplaincy for spiritual guidance. And all of these team members are hospice certified, so they have certification as well as training in understanding how to navigate through those changes during end of life, as well as social work, which is so crucial to us, making sure to navigate through all the concerns that come up, whether it's placement, whether it's ensuring respite care to give a break for the family members that ultimately become caregivers, or even navigating through instances where we need a higher level of care. So we do have a couple inpatient hospice units to make sure that when somebody is in a symptomatic circumstance, they're able to have a higher level of care in an inpatient setting for symptom management, which is for us, Harbor and Franklin Square. And every hospice benefit recipient, it is a consenting service, of course, that you can always revoke if things do change. But one thing we always make sure everybody's aware of as it relates to grief and loss is part of the hospice benefit under Medicare that's 100% covered is making sure that you have 13 months of bereavement, which is so, so crucial.
Mhm.
So I do want to hand it off to Brianne for a moment just to talk about what bereavement support looks like as it relates to the hospice benefit. And then patients that end up sometimes passing not on hospice because it could have been in a later stage of their terminal condition or just, a sudden decline, how we support the community from that standpoint. And then we'll go into our dive deep into the grief and loss.
Yeah, so one of the really cool parts of, I think, Accent Care Hospice is the team that follows for all of our bereaved clients are the patient experience team that was also supporting the patient while the patient was on our services. So our social worker, our chaplain, and our music therapist, they're actually the people that then follow the loved ones or the family members or friends for bereavement as well. So we do a couple of different check-in phone calls throughout those 13 months. We want to cover up until all those anniversaries, all those first holidays, the first birthdays. So we want to check in periodically and just see how they're doing. We also have a various evaluation scale, which we call the bereavement risk assessment, and the clinicians go through with the bereaved client, and they kind of assess where all of our where their needs might be, if they are more low risk needs and they're processing their grief in a healthy way, or if they're moderate to high risk and they might need a little more check-ins, possible outside referrals, and just some ongoing support. We provide things such as grief support groups. We currently have, I believe, 10 grief support groups. Majority of them are still virtual, but we do have one group that now meets in person at Franklin Square Hospital, and we're hoping to get some groups in person going again. Those groups are open to the entire community. Again, no matter how their loved one died or if it was on our service or not, they are welcome to come and attend that. We also provide an annual memorial service that we do for all of our patients who have died. And again, that's open to the community. They would be welcome to come and attend that. And we have a grief support camp called Camp Kangaroo that is catered to children ages 5 to 18. So we had to put the camp on hold a little bit for COVID. We did do a virtual camp in 2021. So that was a really fun activity that we did for our younger community members. But we offered that as well because we know that sometimes our kids are grieving pretty intense when they lose a loved one as well. So all of these services are open to the community. They can give us a call. We have a 24/7 hotline number. And if anyone calls in, especially if we have someone who died before we could enter them into our services, before they could go through the admissions process, we can still follow them for those 13 months for bereavement. They can just call us, let us know that they're interested, give us their demographics and their consent. And we would love to follow them, do just sort of check-in calls, offer grief groups, offer a memorial service. And we also have a list of outside referrals for specialized grief and trauma therapists in our communities. So we break it out by county, but we have a list for all of the counties that we cover. So if someone wants a little more long-term therapy that can, process after those 13 months, we have that available and we can help them find someone within their insurance provider and kind of connect them to those resources. So that's a very sort of general view of all of this stuff. But if you ever have any questions or if anyone has any questions, give us a call. We would love to kind of walk through this process with you.
Thank you, Brianne. Thank you so much. Oh, the number, yes, I will put it in the chat as well for everybody to have. So thank you so much. All right, so we're going to dive into navigating through grief and loss. And a lot of this presentation is going to be really focused in around stages of grief and loss, but also making sure that our goal is to ensure that you have valuable tools that you can utilize. And it is always an ongoing discussion. So in navigating through grief and loss, Warden's tasks of mourning is very important to reference as we work through these aspects and these stages. So our first task is accepting the reality of the loss. And that really involves the task of coming face to face with the fact that that person has passed and is not coming back, right? Their physical being. And a couple different aspects needs to overcome denying the fact of the loss, the meaning of the loss, and that the death is irreversible. So that's one of the first tasks of Warden's mourning. Working through the pain of grief, which is really the process of allowing oneself to experience the pain rather than avoiding it. And then within some cultures, there's this encouragement, the expression of pain, grief, while others discourage it, right? So it's being able to work through those aspects as well. Mourning processes sometimes can be hindered, and something to be mindful of is that this can be hindered by avoiding painful thoughts, using thought stopping techniques, entertaining only pleasant thoughts of the deceased. And that's something naturally that occurs, of course, for a lot of us. The third one is adjusting to an environment where the deceased is missing. So the bereaved take on this new roles and they adjust to the changing environment. And that's something that kind of naturally happens. So that's in the third task. And also experiencing this resentiment as the bereaved realize the magnitude of the loss and challenges of fulfilling roles held by the deceased as well. Lowered self-esteem can be experienced as well, and that's something important to recognize. If failure is experienced in acquiring new roles or needs for role fulfillment, and that is what's related specifically when we're working through, really filling in those shoes, right? And then emotionally relocate the loss and move forward with life. So the emotional relocation requires the bereaved to form a relationship with the memories of the deceased in such a way that fosters an engagement in ongoing life experience. So these are different tasks that go through, and of course the sequences could be left to interpretation. And I'll have Brienne touch a little bit on this in the sense of kind of how this looks when it relates to working through that bereavement process.
Oh, yeah, a lot of it is sort of validating your unique grieving process, and everyone will walk through these sort of tasks differently, and sort of express the pain or the reality or the changing environment as they see best fits their life. I always say, you're an expert in you, we're the expert in grief, so that's okay. Lean into what you know, lean into who you are and how you process your grief. A lot of it is just accepting what you're going through. Task number 2 is one that is very hard, I think, for a lot of us to do, is to feel that pain. And the one thing I always say is the pain and suffering will lessen. The grief won't, because the grief is attached to the love. The grief is attached to the person in our life who we're missing. But that pain and suffering will lessen. And that is a process that you will experience over your time of your grief journey. I always say it's a journey, and I never give an exact time because everyone is different. Everyone walks that journey a little bit differently. But we love Warden's tasks of mourning. We think that they really tackle a lot of the more scientific and evidence-based studies surrounding grief, and it kind of allows everyone to experience it in their own unique way while still maintaining a healthy relationship with themselves and others.
Absolutely. Any questions so far? I just want to touch on this briefly, just because Warden's tasks of mourning is going to be referenced quite a bit. So any questions so far in regards to or personal experiences that could be going through as well? And we'll make sure to leave our information as well so that folks can have that opportunity to reach out. All right, so we're going to go to the next slide. So it's important to know what the common terms are as we go through the process of grief and loss, and what's referenced quite a bit. So we start with loss, being deprived of something of value and meaning. And loss can be related to a lot of different items in your life. And I always say it's not just one thing, it could be a magnitude of multiple things that are happening all at once. Grief, the best explanation is that it's a normal response to loss. And it sounds pretty general, but it really is something that we can't identify as more than that, as that is a reaction that is caused in that response to loss. Mourning is an outward expression of our grief. Anticipatory grief, which we see a lot of times when we work with our hospice patients and their families and extended families, the pain of knowing that that death and other losses will eventually occur. Because we want to make sure to preface that it's not necessarily just about that physical passing, but other losses that occur as it relates to that too. And then bereavement. Bereavement is the period of dealing and coping with the loss. And it truly is a never ending and evolving journey. It's something that we're consistently going through and working how to we can cope with these items. All right, next slide. All right, so when we are navigating through grief and loss, it's important for us to understand the foundational piece, right? Understanding what grief and loss all entails. So, a couple important things that we wanted to make sure everybody was aware of is that grief truly exists in all experiences of loss. And that's why we wanted to make sure to start off with that term. And it's a very normal response. And then grief often includes the physiological distress, the separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, and so many different emotions in dwelling on that past and the apprehension about the future, because there is this element of that unknown. And that intense grief can also have life threatening concerns as well through disruption of the immune system, self neglect, as well as suicidal thoughts. And that is why it's so important to be connected with bereavement specialists, with groups and support systems so that we can make sure that we're identifying, and we'll give you all tools of how you can personally identify when those moments are happening so that we can be successful in our journey. And then grief may also take the form of regret for something lost. It's sometimes a remorse of something that we've done, it could be sorrow. It just could be feeling that we don't have enough in our lives. I also want to utilize this quote. I thought it was something really beautiful because a lot of times, there is a lot of conversation about mental health and what could be identified as mental health when it comes to concerns. But this quote is beautiful. Grief is not an illness or a mental health problem, but grief is a natural part of life. And that's something so important because as we continue to go through this journey, we want to feel that we are kind of part of our society and making sure that we feel entrenched in that normal day to day life while we're working through something that we may not feel is normal. So we want to make sure that we're feeling that this isn't something unusual. So, any questions so far as we're going into the next steps? Okay. All right. Next slide, please. All right. So, impact of grief. So, we did talk a little bit about what grief is, but now just to understand what that impact can look like. And impact of grief is a lot more than what's on the slide, of course, but we want to make sure kind of the foundational basics. So, grief is both an internal and external event. So, our internal experience of that loss is consistently interfacing with the external world around us. So, the two consistently intertwine because of how we're impacted by our external relationships, by different changes that are happening within society, within culture, and different aspects of life. So it's important to recognize that there are those two elements that occur and they intertwine. And that grief is a normal and natural response to that loss, but our individual grief experiences are shaped by many factors. And the many factors could be a change in a job. It could be a change in how we feel throughout that day. It could be a chronic disease management that we're going through, and or it could be different factors in our own personal relationships. It could be also financial burdens that come up. So our grief experiences do consistently change as our lives continue to change and what's around us continues to change. So it's important to acknowledge that. And that grief can impact our ability to concentrate, making decisions, finding things or seeing clearly. And it's really important in this particular piece when we know that grief impacts our cognition so much is remembering to be gentle and patient through this unique process, because it is important for us to ensure that we are recognizing our own abilities and capabilities truly, and recognizing our own boundaries. And we'll talk a little bit about those boundaries as we continue to navigate through um, this this wonderful journey.
I love that you mentioned that here because I tell clients all the time, short-term memory loss is a symptom of grief. So go easy on yourself, especially when you're having those really intense grief reactions. Start, jotting down notes. That's okay. Post-it notes to remind yourself of things. That's okay. It doesn't mean that you're, possibly dealing with any sort of health crisis or anything. Just you might just be grieving. So short-term memory loss is a symptom of grief. I remind people of that often.
Thank you so much, Brianne. So we will dive in deeper, of course, with these types of grief. And there are other types of grief that are not listed here, but these are the kind of the main meat and potatoes, as we like to say. So cumulative grief, which is also referenced sometimes as compound grief, traumatic grief, ambiguous loss, anticipatory grief, and disenfranchised grief. And we wanted to really touch on these types of grief because they are kind of the main focal points that we tend to see oftentimes as folks are going through different processes in their own grief. So we'll the next slide. All right. So cumulative grief, which can be referenced as compound grief, and why it can be referenced this way is because it occurs when an individual experiences multiple losses, either all at once or before processing an earlier loss, they have something further. And when you experience multiple losses within a short time, you may begin to wonder how much more loss can you endure. Now, one thing we always want to make sure everybody's aware of is that multiple losses does not mean, as we talked about earlier in those common terms, it does not mean a a person, right? Losing a person. It could mean losing a person. It could mean losing somebody in your life, and then it could be that you are, the loss of mobility at that same time, right? From a terminal condition, or a chronic disease management concern that's coming up. So, or it could be that you're in the same time of losing somebody that you care for. It could be also that you are also having to relocate, right? You're sometimes having to build back up because you're selling your home. Or it could be loss of culture that happens as well. Sometimes when we are grieving a loss of somebody that passes, we also tend to see that there could be that loss of, you know, that that culture standpoint, right? So sometimes we're also losing that ability to come in and provide for our own culture, right? So there's different losses that accumulate and that compound all together. And we wanted to really make sure cumulative grief also sometimes is referenced as bereavement overload, right? Because we are overwhelmed by so much happening at once. So wanted to really have this picture because this really engages into what some of the symptoms look like so that we have some recognition and awareness as we're going through this cumulative grief that you may be experiencing potentially. So there's that numbness and inability to feel or express emotions, which can lead to frustration and prolong your grief, which could make it more complex and complicated. which is again why it's so, so important to work with your support systems.
Mhm.
Avoidance, which is distancing yourself from activities, places, or people who remind you of your loss, right? Because sometimes it's a little bit easier, or we feel like it's a little bit easier to just relocate ourselves in the moment. Guilt, thinking about what you could have done differently, causing you to keep replaying your loss
Mhm.
because you feel like you've done something wrong. And then fatigue, appetite loss, sleep issues, or anxiety, which contribute to a cycle of exhaustion and also really bring into that cognitive impairment that we were talking about earlier. All of these items really create that overwhelming feeling and, of course, have that spiral vortex effect. But we are here to support, we're here to help. So, next slide is to really go dive into deeper of what are some items you can do in coping with this impact? And I'll have Brienne chat about some of these items so that we can make sure that even if we're not coming to a bereavement support group, we do have some items we can personally be doing.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you had the slide right before talking about bereavement overload symptoms, because sometimes a lot of those symptoms can start compounding on top of each other, and slowly grief can eventually start to look like depression. There are some different signs and different things to be aware of when, so you mentioned that numbness, when that became sort of overwhelming, that's when depression might be also seeping in, and it could be a very concerning sign. So it's good to have, like you said, a good support system, a good, we call them grief tools for your toolbox, that you can then reach in and grab. Because sometimes you'll need a screwdriver, but sometimes you need a hammer. And I think it's okay to go in and find different resources and different things that you can lean on. The number one that we really recommend is talking to someone. It doesn't necessarily have to be us as a hospice or professionals. It can just be a good friend or a good family member or someone who will validate you, listen, and let you sort of share whatever you're going through. So that's always a number one there. Write a daily journal. I love this one. It's sometimes very hard for us to, measure our grieving journey, our grief journey, and our grieving process on a day-to-day schedule. But if we write down, even if it's just a sentence or two every day, to talk kind of how about where you've been and how you're processing, in a year or so, you can open up that journal and sort of see where you've come. And see like, oh, this is what I was dealing with back a year ago. And I really have made some really good steps on my grief journey. I really have been able to process my grief in a healthy way. And I think it's a really good way that you can kind of look at yourself and validate how you've been processing it as well. Practice mindfulness. A lot of times our actions, we have to kind of sit with ourselves and make sure that we are making mindful actions, especially when we're dealing with grief and dealing with that heavy loss. I really like to express it as heavy because it feels like a weight on top of you while you're processing it. So being mindful with others, being mindful with yourself, I think is really important. Creating a daily routine. When in doubt, fall into a healthy routine. And, if even if it's just getting up in the morning, eating some sort of breakfast that gives you a little bit of fuel, and then going about your sort of daily tasks. You can also, in that daily routine, schedule out time for your grief. I've had clients who were very, very organized and a very strict schedule that they had to keep to. And we're finding that they were sort of avoiding their grief and pushing it aside. So I said, let's schedule in an hour for you to just cry. And so she did. She scheduled in an hour and she gave herself that time. And sometimes it was tears, but sometimes it was anger or frustration or, you know, guilt. We talked about guilt. So she gave herself that hour and she told her family and friends, like, this is my time. So create a daily routine. And if that means incorporating some grief in that, that's okay too. Um, and then practice gratitude. I think this is hard sometimes when you're in the beginning, really acute grief phase, because you're dealing with a lot of that pain and suffering that goes along with the grief. But as that does sort of lessen, really practicing some gratitude and practicing for the relationships, for the relationship you had with the loved one. Grief is a consequence of love, so that love being there is something that is precious, and it does go along with that pain, but really being grateful for sort of the situation as you're starting to process, and being grateful that you're starting to process through that grief. That can be good too. Another just sort of coping is, when in doubt, give us a call, or when you're sort of stuck, finding outside resources like groups or things like that, as well as doing something creative. Some people don't want to just talk. Some people want to do. So go and build in your workshop, or go and take a long walk out in a beautiful day. That can sometimes also alleviate some of those stresses. Have multiple tools for your grief toolbox.
Thank you so much. Yes, be kind to yourselves,
Mhm.
please. Talk about that. So, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you. So we're going to go on to our next form of grief, traumatic grief. And this could be a severe form of separation distress that usually occurs following the sudden and unexpected death of a loved one. It could be sometimes estrangement that we had from a family member. It could be, the loss of something that we didn't recognize how much we cared for. That could feel traumatic as well. It could also be instances where somebody suddenly passed that did not have we did not expect to pass. Right? It could be from car accident, could be from a sudden heart attack, those types of things. So it's really important for us to recognize what form of grief that looks like. And oftentimes we reference those wonderful coping tools as well for that traumatic grief, and making sure to have that alliance. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So ambiguous loss. And ambiguous loss is something that I think we tend to see a little bit more frequently than we think we do. Simply because a lot of times we want something that's tangible, and these are not tangible. So ambiguous losses are uncertain losses that are often not acknowledged. And this could be grieving someone who's physically not present, but they are present in the sense of they're still around, and we're not able to physically see them, right? So this could be a divorce, right? So that the physical presence is there, but we just do not acknowledge that connection is there anymore. So we're grieving that potential piece as well. That absence in our lives could be estrangement from a family member. Could be various illnesses that we are unable to have control over. So it could be instances where, we're starting to have certain declines with, could be a pulmonary disease or heart failure, different instances, dementia. We frequently see this ambiguous loss because it relates to things that we're losing as we're continuing in the progression of that illness potentially. But again, it's important to recognize and acknowledge what this loss is so that we can formulate our own coping mechanisms and healing process. Anything that you want to mention, Brianna, on the coping for ambiguous loss, as it oftentimes relates to our work?
A lot of times is putting a name to it, saying that this is a part of grief, and sort of speaking the terms out loud can be really powerful, especially if it is a situation of a type of dementia where your loved one is here in front of you. You can touch them, you can but that relationship has changed, that dynamic has changed, and that can be a very ambiguous loss that a lot of times people don't want to talk about it, because they're like, well, my loved one's still alive, my mother's still here, my spouse is still here, I'm grateful for that, which is a valid point. But it's also okay to say, I miss being able just to talk to her, or just let her tell an inside family joke, because she no longer gets that anymore. I miss the way we would just, share openly. And that's okay. It's okay to sort of speak that there has been a loss, and that you are processing that grief even before the death has occurred, which kind of goes into our next slide that we're going to talk about, which is anticipatory grief.
Hmm. And then a lot of times, yeah, absolutely. With that being said, I mean, that anticipatory grief is very much tied into ambiguous loss, and
Yes.
and that is nice part to see about the types of grief and loss is that there is a lot of this intertwining, intermingling between all of these concepts and terms. And we usually think of this grief as something that happens, you know, after death, but that's usually what we think of grief in general, right? But
Mhm.
grief can also be felt in the anticipation of a death or not or other kind of loss, right? So when you know what to expect in a specific disease process, right? Or when you're a caregiver to a family member that has, let's say, something like dementia, or they had previously a stroke, right? So we understand because the physician has expressed to us what are items that would happen as time goes on and what loss we experience, right? The loss of our communication with that person, right? So, as Brianne put it so beautifully, that we can grieve that aspect of the loss of that communication, right? And it almost feels, in a sense, selfish that we feel that that person is there, but we feel uncertain that that we are grieving that loss of being able to share that joke, right? To share that memory. So it's recognizing what we're going through, and again, remembering that this is a normal response to loss, and that it's okay, that it's us being human.
Yeah.
And as soon
Yeah.
as the possibility of death occurs in our minds, it is possible and natural for us to begin to grieve, right? Because as it relates to that definition, right, of loss, it's being deprived of something of value and meaning. So that cognition is value and meaning, that communication, that connection that we feel with people, or just, it could be what what is being taken away from us or feels like it's being taken away from us. And it could be sometimes also as it relates to the community. We oftentimes see that it could be changes in a neighborhood.
Mhm.
Where things are changing in terms of more developments, or changes even to our daily programming sometimes. So it's recognizing that it's okay to grieve those items, and how do we work through that and being able to control what we can control, which is most important. So acknowledgement is always there. um, but this also typically not just happens in serious or terminal illnesses, but also when we are working with folks that are battling addictions of different sorts, or is leaving for military deployment. And it really includes a wide range of feelings that are processed. And again, that recognition, there's no right or wrong way to grieve, and being able to utilize those tools in your toolbox that we hope that you are gathering from today's presentation, of course. Right. Next slide. And disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is something that, similar to ambiguous loss, I feel a lot of people do experience quite frequently. And this was identified as grief that persons experience that they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. And this happens sometimes when a relationship is not recognized as a loss, could be an affair, could be a friendship, or relationship ending. It could be colleagues, right? Professionals. It could be, oftentimes in healthcare, when we work with patients and families for many years, right? That's something we still grieve. Estrangement, where someone has not died but chose to end that relationship, right? So we still grieve those items, and we still grieve that connection, and that is normal, of course, and it's not socially recognized or understood. But one thing we did want to highlight in this particular slide is that as we continue to evolve and progress, this concept of our chosen family is continuing to progress further, because as we know, there's our blood related family, and then we have friends and colleagues and even folks that we support in the community that become part of our chosen family. So it becomes less and less of that, almost like a feeling like of a bubble of disenfranchised, but becoming part of that norm. But again, like we mentioned before, all of this is normal response. One thing to recognize in disenfranchised grief is that the griever is not socially recognized as someone who is grieving, or people will try to protect them by preventing these individuals from their right to grieve, right? So Sometimes you'll notice, we try to protect children from the awareness of loss, because we're trying to make sure that they're, not going through that process that we know can be so challenging. Or a lot of times there's children that protect their parents that are, that are, starting to have maybe certain um, different prognostic issues that are happening within their own illnesses, and they want to protect them because they don't want to upset them. And it's all coming from a place of love and care, but that is still associated with that disenfranchised grief. It's folks that are trying to protect us from the the reality of what we're facing, and they're trying to make sure that we have that consistent positive feeling. But one thing we always try to focus on is, especially when we identify these items, and one thing that we do as part of accent care is we do Camp Kangaroo, which Brienne, of course, is our main spokesperson for, where we're able to make sure that parents and guardians and caregivers of those children feel comfortable in having a pathway to children being able to have acceptance within grief and being able to speak about this grief rather than shielding them from that, because now they have tools in their toolbox. So that's one way that we try to help folks with that disenfranchised grief.
Yeah. And since you touched on just kids a little bit, the previous grief that we were talking about, anticipatory grief, we found that bringing kids a part of that conversation before the death has occurred, a lot of times gives them permission to talk about it and to share openly, and it lessens the trauma that might come along with that death. So it lessens that sort of disenfranchised nature that they might feel, including more traumatic deaths and including things like suicide, which can be very disenfranchised grief, or miscarriages, and all of those items that a lot of times society doesn't want to talk about or doesn't want to validate that grief, because it's a part of life, and it is a part of that person's life, and so we should still acknowledge the grief that goes along with it. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Thank you. Thank you. Acknowledgement is very key. And that's why we want to make sure everybody's aware of what this all looks like and how to navigate through this. Because it's, in order to navigate through grief and loss, we have to know what the definitions could look like, and what categories they fit into. So thank you so much, Dan. All right, next slide. All right. So secondary loss. This is something really important for us to touch on because we see this often in our line of work, and our line of serving our community that we're so grateful to do. Where the death of a loved one is considered the primary loss, their experiences that flow from that death are considered secondary losses. So that could be considered, right, like referencing back to that cumulative and compound losses. There could be a lot of different things that occur during that death of a loved one. And this picture really puts into perspective some of the items that consistently occur, just on a broader spectrum. Loss of income, it could be a loss of support system, right? Sometimes we think that we have specific friends or folks in the community that we thought we could rely on, and then we recognize that maybe they have specific boundaries that aren't, capable of that connection. Loss of identity at times, right? So we feel lost in who we are. Loss of dreams for the future, right? Because we have this hopelessness, but our goal is to build hope, right? This is the purpose of all that we're talking about. Loss of faith, right? So we start questioning our own spiritual guidance sometimes, and loss of confidence or loss of financial security. Sometimes with that primary loss, there's elements of losing, potentially housing, right? Potentially other items that were associated with that person. And it's okay to say, these are part of my grieving processes. And what do I have to do next to create that success? So we'll go on to the next slide as we go into that. All right. So it's important to also, as it relates to secondary losses, also recognizing the everyday life experiences. So we're always oscillating between loss oriented experiences and emotions and restoration oriented experiences and emotions. And this really, this picture helps understand that dual process model of coping with bereavement. So it helps us relate to the connections between the grief work, intrusion of grief, and how it relates to then attending to life changes, doing new things, because we have to be able to connect the two, right?
Mhm.
As we're trying to work towards success, we also have to recognize there are certain barriers that we have to work through in our loss oriented experiences. Anything that you want to touch on, Brienne, in regards to this connection in the dual process model of coping with bereavement?
I think my favorite is the arrow because it really does bounce back and forth. And sometimes it's up and down and it's all over the place because there's times where you're breaking bonds. Sometimes that is a secondary losses or that you're breaking a bond with the person who died. But then you're also trying to create like new relationships. So all the way down at the bottom of the restoration oriented, you're trying to create new relationships and stuff that will never necessarily replace that love that you had for the person who died, but it's new and we still are social beings and need that love and relationship. So sometimes it's okay to go back and forth and then to have back up to that grief work throughout the day. Sometimes this could change every day to day, it can change hour to hour. And I think acknowledging that you're trying to figure out who you are today after the death of this significant person in your life.
Yeah. And it's important for us to continue to acknowledge that we are working towards our own restoration, but we never forget, right? We understand that in the background there are certain items we have to do to work towards our own success, and acknowledgement that there are those items that we have to work through so that we can be more successful in how we individually cope with that grief and loss as we continue to work through those items. Thank you so much. Next slide. All right, so we're getting down to the last couple, and we definitely want to leave a couple moments to share. So we'll take 2 more minutes for the slides. Bereavement support. We do want to touch on the Mourner's Bill of Rights, but I just want to go through this slide as just a couple items that can be supportive, in addition to, of course, the support groups and the wonderful tools in our toolbox. So some of the items we want you all to remember is that grief is learning to live in a world without your loved one, right? It doesn't mean that it has to feel okay. It doesn't mean that it has to be something that we feel is normal. It just means that it's learning, right? And evolving. And it's learning to live in a world that is always changing, right? As we're evolving. Important to remind ourselves that our grief is valid and worthy of sharing and support, especially as we help maybe others. And something we notice in bereavement support groups, as Brienne can probably attest to as well, is that, oftentimes we want to be present for others that are going through grief in different losses, but remembering that other people's losses do not detract from our own loss. It doesn't mean that our own loss is not valid. And no matter how much time goes by, recognizing that our grief is always going to be valid and worthy for sharing and support. There's no timeline on it. There is no, lack of connection to that person that we lost. It is unique to us. Taking a break from some of those loss oriented feelings and emotions that we are traditionally think of as grief, right? So sometimes taking a moment to create those boundaries. It's so important to recognize the need for boundaries, whether that means, having that moment of our own isolation and recognizing that awareness in that, and also recognizing when we need help or when we're not able to help others in that moment because we need to take care of our own mind, body, and spirit, and that we're not alone. We are all in this together in our own unique ways, that is special to us, and making sure that we're working with community resources that are out there. There are so many, especially through the Department of Aging,
Mhm.
that we're able to utilize, and Accent Care as well is a great resource to be able to connect us further into how we can be more successful as we're helping others through grief and loss, and as well as dealing with grief and loss sometimes as a caregiver perspective, where whether we're utilizing hospice or we're utilizing the bereavement additional support services. So those are items important to remember and recognize that they're there for your availability. And then self-compassion and grief, right? Be kind to yourself. Don't compare yourself to others. Accepting that a wide range of that emotional and physical and cognitive experiences are all part of those grieving processes. Giving distressing emotion the time and attention it needs. Instead of us walking away, being able to really sit in on that, right?
Mhm.
Asking for help, accepting help, which is very hard to do, but it's so important so that we can make sure we're working closely on that restoration. Focusing on basic needs, sleeping, eating. Sometimes we miss just the basics, and it's important for us to place that focus on that if nothing else is going on that we can have that control over, right? Giving yourself a break, allowing that break. It's very similar to asking for help sometimes. Love the person who passed unapologetically. I think this is something really beautiful because a lot of times we feel that we need to uh, feel guilty for how much time sometimes goes by in our grieving process, or an emotion that's prolonged during our grieving process, but recognizing that our love for that person will always continue. And that's something so beautiful and unique to us, and accumulating the small moments of comfort. I love that statement because of, right? So, you know, recognizing the impact that that person created, or that time in our life created, right? Whether it was a job that we lost, whether it was a community that we moved away from. Because of this community, I'm able to enjoy X, Y, and Z in my life, right? Because of my mother, I'm able to cook this specific dish, right? So those beautiful things that create really moments of comfort and moments of clarity and peace, and bring us joy in our own lives. So I'm gonna uh, have us take a look at that mourner's Bill of Rights as something to preface as well. But one of the closing remarks we just wanted to share as we go into the mourner's book, A Bill of Rights, is this beautiful quote: "All of us do it, and it's a universal response to change, but we do it differently. It's unique as our fingerprints." And this gorgeous picture here, a huge thank you to Brianne and one of our national directors, Yelena, for sharing. This is actually a picture of a patient that we worked with, and something that we do part of legacy projects. This is a patient and her daughter that is sharing a fingerprint necklace. And that's something that we do as part of our legacy projects in our hospice work, so that the family that is continuing to live on once that physical person leaves continues to have something to hold on to. It's a beautiful memory. It's something that's tangible, right? A lot of times we like things that are tangible, um, on top of the things that are not tangible, sometimes certain memories and thoughts that they leave us with. So this is something just really beautiful as part of our work. So I think we have like 2 minutes. I wanted to see if we can go through the Bill of Rights, and I'll share one more quote after that. So does everybody have the Mourner's Bill of Rights?
No, I do not. It would be nice to share. Thank you.
Yeah, it's in the chat box. So we just want to make sure everybody gets a copy of the Bill of Rights. And this really is a fantastic tool and takeaway for everybody to utilize. Of course, if you have any questions or any support needs from all of this, let us know. And we're happy to share that. We want to leave a couple minutes for any shared experiences. There's so much more we can touch on a bereavement, but we want to make sure to leave a couple of those moments. And any closing remarks from the audience?
I don't know if this is visible, but this is what it would look like for the Mourner's Bill of Rights. Is that on there?
If you send that to me, I can make sure everybody gets it if they can't get it out of the chat.
I'll send it, no problem.
Thank you. And Anna, thank you very much. And I'm sorry, your other partner, I just can't see the name, sorry, for a wonderful presentation. Very well said. Beautifully done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any last comments and any, and of course, you all can privately message us. I know sometimes we have certain things that come to mind later in the day. So by all means, let us know. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. It's such an important work that's done. Bereavement is something that is ever evolving, and it's important for us to continue to speak about. And we look forward to more workshops. And please share your thoughts and your own experiences so we can continue to build on our support for the community. Any closing remarks from you, Brian?
No, thank you for the time. Just sitting down with us. Please let us know if you have any questions, or if you're just having a hard day and you had a tough bereaved client, give us a call. We're here to help and offer support and just give you a listening ear too. So we're here.
Thank you. And one last piece I just want to close out with is a beautiful, beautiful quote that I think really sums up our need for continuing our journey of hope. So Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And I think that's really beautifully said, because a lot of times we feel disappointment from different series of losses, but our goal, especially today and moving forward always, is to continue to reframe hope, refocus hope, and being able to empower feelings of hope. So we pray and hope that you all are able to feel more hopeful after today, and we are here to support you all. And thank you guys for your time.
Thank you.